In this lesson, we're going to learn about working with mesh and lace, how to adapt a pattern, some basics of sewing on mesh fabrics, and we're going to look at some neck and sleeve details. So let's jump in and look at some finished shirts. This shirt is a single layer, and I did it in a single layer because it's pretty opaque, and I designed it as a layering piece rather than something that I would wear just as is. So if I wear it as is, I wear a little camisole underneath. The neck on this is going to be the same neck that we're going to see on the t-shirt that I'm demonstrating, and I've actually used the same little simple neck finish as a sleeve finish here. Some basic things about meshes is I don't pre-shrink them. I cut them right off the bolt. Before you start, and let me show you another example. The difference in this shirt is it has a double hem. So the whole t-shirt is a double layer and the hem is cut on the fold. And the neck on this t-shirt is exactly the same as on the polka dot one. It has a raw edge, and we'll see how to do this in a few minutes. Now let's take a look at some mesh fabrics. These are all over ready to wear, and they're all a little bit different. So for instance, this one is a very fine grained one and has little flocked polka dots on it. Most of these are nylon. They all have a little bit of lycra, not a lot of lycra. This particular one, I find a lot of these and I love them. They're wonderful to work with. They have a lot of crosswise stretch. They have good recovery, but they have open spaces in them, and that's what makes them a little bit challenging to work with. And this last one has even more open spaces in it. So it's actually a point de sprie. It's got little woven in polka dots and then a print laid on top of it. So they're all similar and they're all going to handle in a slightly different way. Now, first of all, you want to make sure that the pattern is fit to you. Then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your basic pattern piece and create what we call a full pattern piece. So here what I've done is I've taken my front, and because the hem is cut on a fold, it needs to be a straight line. So I've straightened that line out, and what we're going to end up with is a full pattern piece that looks like this. This is going to be my hem, and that's going to be cut on the fold. And we're going to take a look at that right now. Let's consider how to lay out a mesh fabric, and it's really, really simple. In my studio, I do it on a big table, and I'll make a fold in the fabric and put the front and the back side by side. Here, I've cut my piece out already, but I want to show you a couple of tricks. First of all, the important thing is the hem is cut on the fold, okay? So that's what's going on here. Now, the fold line is a really important reference point when you go to sew the seam together. So what I do here is I do everything with the rotary cutter. I use it like an extension of my hand. So at the hem, I just take out a little pie-shaped wedge. It'll be enclosed in the seam. At the center front and center back, I make a little nick that I can see, and I make a nick to mark my sleeve markings. Now, you could do this with, you could do these markings with tracing paper if you want to, but I find this is quick and easy, and now we're done, and we're ready to actually take the pattern piece off and sew the pieces together. So now, what I've done is I have sewed my front and back together on these long side seams. And you end up with this piece that doesn't really look like any garment you've ever sewn before, because that's basically a long tube. So let me give you some sewing and tips about sewing with mesh. First of all, you're going to take your scraps and do a test. Test with a regular foot test with a walking foot, see what happens. If you run into trouble, I go from my regular foot to a walking foot. If the fabric bunches up a little bit, and it can with some of these meshes, especially the really airy ones, if they don't have a lot of thread in there, the sewing machine doesn't like to sew through air, so it can pucker. So the secret here is to use some kind of a stabilizer. You can use tissue paper, you can use computer paper. I like this totally stable stabilizer because it has a little bit of tooth to it. And what I'm going to do here when I go to sew my seam, and this can be with or without the walking foot, is you just place that stabilizer on your seam and you're going to sew right through it. I use 1-inch strips. I keep a little stack of them by the side of the sewing machine, and I just line up the edge of the stabilizer with my fabric so I know I'm sewing a true seam width. And then when you're done, you just tear it away and you're good to go. When you're finished, I always trim my seams to 1/4 inch, so that's what I've done here. I don't serge the seams because I find that all that thread in there isn't really necessary. This fabric isn't going to ravel and it presses quite nicely. So once you have done that, and then you want to turn it inside out. So this is the fun part. I'm going to take my tube, basically, and I'm working here with the side seams, and I'm going to match up the side seams, and what'll happen is it's going to form the shape of the shirt. So what I'll do at this point is I'll pin it at the side seams, and I've got another sample all prepped and ready to show you. So let me show you how it's going to look once you've turned it and got it ready for the next step. So at this point, this is what it's going to look like. So what I've done is I've pinned it together at the side seam. So this is holding it. I have prepped the shoulder seam because these are stretchy fabrics. What I've done at the shoulder seam is to fuse a piece of fusible tricot that'll stabilize this neck edge and it'll keep it from stretching while you're wearing it. So that's on the back pattern piece. Doesn't matter which one, just both sides. And then I stay stitch the neck edge. So you want to stay stitch front and back, shoulder to center. Once I've done all that, then I take the whole piece to the ironing board, and it's really simple to just press the hem into place. Do be careful with your iron temperature. I like to use a Teflon sole plate. A lot of these meshes are made of nylon, and if your iron's too hot, it can melt. That's not good. So at this point, I have sewed my right shoulder seam together. I've pressed the seams toward the back and top stitched it so that holds everything neat and clean in place. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to finish the neck edge. I throw the pattern piece away for this particular treatment. I use my metal ruler. This is a 2-inch ruler, and I've cut 2-inch width on the cross grain. You want the band to have a little bit of bounce to it when you go to sew it in place. You can sew this using a single or a double needle, and I encourage you to make a little test of both and see which one you like. I use both in different t-shirts. So now we're going to go to the fun part of working at the sewing machine, and these are your tools. Your fingers are really going to work a lot of the magic. So this is where the testing part comes in. I use 1 pin. I have cut my band a precise width but longer than my neck edge, and we'll trim it at the end. So we'll start, and I am going to take the pin out right away. Let's go secure it with a back stitch. So I've set my machine so that the needle stops down, that's a big help. And then and I'm also starting at the left back. Now, if by chance you reverse the shoulder seam and you're starting with the right, don't worry. I like to start at the back just to get in case I make a mistake, and get my tension secure. Because what I'm doing as I sew is I'm applying a little bit of tension, and not too much, not too little, and that's going to depend on your fabric. So this is why you want to make a test. So after I've sewed a couple of inches, I'll peel back the band and take a look to see that there aren't any puckers, and that it's feeding pretty evenly. This looks just fine, so I'm going to keep on going. And the important thing is to keep an even tension. Notice too, I am not using the walking foot. I'm using a regular foot so I can control the tension. Notice too that I sew a couple of inches and then I stop. I'm stitching about a 5/8 inch seam, but at the end we're going to trim this all evenly. So be consistent. Consistency is more important than perfection here. So now we're coming around into the front. I'm still applying just about the same amount of tension. I'm doing my best to keep my seam width even. So at the center front, I've placed 2 pins about 2 inches on either side of the center front. I'm coming up to that first pin here. So that's my warning sign to when I get to the pin, I'm going to apply a little bit more tension. So another good reason for you to make a test before you do this, because how much is a little more? That's going to depend very much on your fabric. Notice I'm pulling a little more securely, but evenly. And sometimes I have to go back and redo this. I like to say if I'm not failing, I'm not being creative or adventurous enough or experimental enough. So here I'm coming to that second pin. Now I'm coming up, finishing the front neck. And the next thing we're going to move on to is pressing. Now we're ready for the final pressing. And what I always do first is I will go in and press everything flat as it was sewn. That's kind of a general rule for any sewing I do. But now I'm going to take my neckline to the tailor's ham, and I am going to press it so that everything goes up. And the beauty of working on a ham as opposed to a flat surface is that I'm actually sculpting the fabric. So I'm going to go all the way around the neckline and press in. I really want to set that fold and have it be clean and even. And then once this is done, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my cutting mat and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to trim everything off because, as you can see, my little ends aren't trimmed. And we're going to even up the width on the whole neckband. Here's my extra length. You can use a ruler for this, but I just eyeball it. Now you can see I've got the neckline laid out here and my band is a little bit wide. You could leave it like that if you want. You can leave it any width you want. I've set my rotary cutter. I'm going to trim mine to about 5/8 of an inch. So I've set my rotary cutter and guide arm, and I am just going to use the guide arm as a guide and trim. And what's going to happen is underneath I have now 3 layers of mesh. So if I peel this back, see, you can see I have a beautiful even width. And it's a raw edge, it's never going to fray, it's stabilized. So I would just finish cutting. And Now let's bring in the sleeve because I did the same finish on the sleeve. So for this particular garment, you have to sew the sleeve in the round. So here's the same neck and sleeve finish, kind of go together. And then when you go to sew the sleeve in, you definitely want to sew it in the round. And something I've learned is I set all my t-shirt sleeves in the round. Now they just fit better.